Bible is full of stories that we all know and love. But how well do we know them? The answer might surprise you. The Bible you thought you knew is going to dive deep into the exquisite details of the biblical stories that make them fascinating and transforming. In this week's podcast, we will conclude the spate of stories that narrate events that had such a negative impact on King David's adult children. Keep in mind that in a sense, David brought this tragedy on himself. Though he was ultimately forgiven for his adultery and murder, there were nevertheless serious consequences that he had to face. What would be a worse judgment for any parent than to witness one's children, even adult children, undergo such life-altering experiences? The final straw in these awful episodes was the death of David's son, Absalom. Last week, recall that Ahithophel and Hushai gave advice to Absalom about the best way of dealing with David's forces. Ahithophel argued that Absalom should not expose himself when soldiers confronted David's troops. Hushai countered this strategy by insisting that Absalom should not make the mistake of thinking his father was that weak. After all, David had been a brilliant military strategist, was fighting for his political life, and would consequently not be a pushover. For these reasons, Absalom should confront David's forces in an open battlefield. Though initially positive about Ahithophel's advice, Absalom and his advisors immediately opted for Hushai's plan. It turns out that the Lord had a role in this about-face. God made Hushai's inferior advice seem positive, and Ahithophel's superior advice seem negative. The Lord did this as a way of punishing Absalom. Those are the first 14 verses of chapter 17 of 2 Samuel. Once Hushai's advice was accepted, he summoned the two priests, Zadok and Abiathar, to get word to David. These priests were, of course, moles, who were planted so that they could acquire intelligence that would benefit David. They wanted to warn David to stay away from the fords in the wilderness. That would be the most vulnerable position for David's troops. That's in verses 15 through 18 of chapter 17. At the time, David had two operatives, Jonathan and Ahimaaz, waiting at En-Rogel, a spring near the southeast corner of Jerusalem, to meet with a young woman who passed on secret information to them, after which they would report to David. It is not clear how this woman garnered the information, but the two men had to be careful not to enter the city, since they might be recognized. Unfortunately, their cover was blown when a lad spotted the two men and immediately informed Absalom. Of course, they were forced to go into hiding. They quickly found a house at Bahurim, which was close to the Mount of Olives. This house had a well in the courtyard. The two men got into the well, and the lady of the house put a cover on the well and spread grain on top of the cover. When Absalom's servants were searching for these two men, they came across the very house where the men were hiding. Naturally, they inquired. The woman admitted that they had been there recently, but lied that they had already left. The men pursued the two men who had been hiding, but when they could not find them, returned to Jerusalem. That's in verses 17 through 20 of chapter 17. Once Absalom's men were gone, Jonathan and Ahimaaz went right to David to let him know what was going on. David responded by moving his troops over the Jordan River, and in the meantime, Ahithophel could not handle the fact that his advice had not been followed. He went back to his home city, put his affairs in order, and took his own life. That's in verses 21 to 23 of chapter 17. David's troops went to Mahanaim after crossing the Jordan River, while Absalom's forces crossed the river also and set up in Gilead, which was close by. That's in verse 24. Absalom had put Amasa in charge of his army instead of Joab. When David got to Mahanaim, he was offered provisions from 3 men who clearly wanted David to prevail. They supplied David's troops with beds, basins, pottery, wheat, barley, meal, parched grain, beans, lentils, honey, curds, sheep, and cheese. They pulled out all the stops to ensure that David and his army were well taken care of. Absalom enjoyed no comparable support from the population. That's in verses 27 through 29 of chapter 17. Just before the pending battle was enjoined, David divided his troops into 3 divisions, each under a different commander. 1/3 was led by Joab, whom Absalom had bypassed in favor of Amasa. 1/3 was commanded by Abishai, Joab's brother, and 1/3 was under the command of Ittai the Gittite. That's the first 2 verses of chapter 18. David himself was ready to participate, but his officers advised him to stay away from direct combat. They wanted to make certain that David was not immediately killed, which would have been completely demoralizing. David acceded to their request that he stay on the sidelines during the battle itself. That's in verses 3 through 4 of chapter 18. However, just before they marched into harm's way, David instructed his 3 field commanders to, quote unquote, deal gently with Absalom. Everyone else heard David issue these orders. That's in verse 5 of chapter 18. When the armies engaged, David's forces defeated handily Absalom's army. Indeed, those supporting Absalom suffered incredible casualties. Even the terrain took a terrible toll on Absalom's army. His effort to take over his father's kingship ended up being a miserable failure. That's in verses 6 through 8 of chapter 18. Still, Absalom himself was unscathed initially. However, unfortunately for him, he found himself in a completely vulnerable situation. He had been riding on a mule which went under the thick branches of a tree. When that happened, Absalom somehow got caught and was held fast. Almost immediately, a soldier told Joab that Absalom had been found alive. Joab could not believe that Absalom had managed not to be killed on the spot. Joab said that he would have gladly paid good money to see Absalom dead. But the man who had spotted him demurred. After all, he protested, this was King David's own son. Not only that, But the man had heard David explicitly tell not only Joab, but the two other commanders to go easy on Absalom. Plus, the man said that if he had killed Absalom, there was a good chance that Joab would not have supported taking Absalom's life because he would want to be in a good place with David. That's in verses 9 through 13 of chapter 18. Joab had heard enough. He blurted out that he was not about to continue this silly argument. Having said this, Joab took 3 darts and thrust them into Absalom, who was still stuck in the tree's branches. Some of Joab's armor-bearers joined in the slaughter by finishing off the king's son, who died immediately. That's in verses 14 through 15. That would take care of Absalom's revolt once and for all. At this point, Joab blew the trumpet to signal that the hostilities should cease. After the ceasefire, Absalom's body was thrown into a pit, after which a great heap of stones covered the corpse. With Absalom gone, people got off the battlefield quickly and headed for home. That's in verses 16 and 17 of chapter 18. Ironically, Absalom had previously erected a pillar for himself in the king's valley for when he died. Since he had no son to make sure he was remembered upon his death, Absalom had in effect arranged for his own funeral monument. Of course, that monument was now replaced with an ignominious reminder of his tragic death. That's in verse 18. After a dispute as to who should tell David what had happened, the scene shifts to David sitting between 2 gates on the lookout for messengers. That's in verses 19 through 24. A watchman soon reported that a messenger was running toward the king. David asks whether the messenger is alone. The watchman responds that he now sees 2 men running toward them. The watchman thought he recognized the messenger who was ahead of the 2 runners, namely Ahimaaz. The king was glad to hear this, thinking that this man was surely bringing good news. That's in verses 25 through 27. When Ahimaaz got there, his only message was that the king should be grateful that God had delivered him from his enemies. But David asked what had happened to Absalom. Ahimaaz said only that there had been furious activity, but he did not know more than that. This meant David would need to wait for more news. That's in verses 28 through 30. The next man soon arrived. Once again, the news seemed good. This man told David that the Israelite deity had delivered David on this very day from the power of those who had risen against the king. Once again, though, David seemed more interested in what Absalom's fate had been. At this point, the messenger pulled no punches. He said that he had hoped that all of David's enemies would be treated as Absalom had been treated. David now realized that Absalom had, in fact, been killed. Naturally, he wept, crying out, "O my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would I had died instead of you, O Absalom, my son, my son." That's in verses 31 through 33. With this bitter end, with this pitiful image of King David, with the agony of a father lamenting his own son's violent death, this saga comes to a tragic conclusion. David had indeed paid at least 4 times the punishment he had demanded the rich man in Nathan's story pay. David had been absolved of his sins, but those sins, nevertheless, had consequences. David's family was left in shambles after his affair with Bathsheba and his murder of her husband. His daughter had been raped. The son who had committed this heinous sin was killed. Absalom became completely alienated, even after being in David's presence, and this son was eventually assassinated by Joab, David's general. Joab, of course, was the military officer who had carried out David's orders to have Uriah killed. Bitter irony abounds in this sordid episode in the life of the great King David. I want you to go to my website, FrankSpina.com. It is being rearranged and improved on as we speak. This improvement will continue. Let me know what your email is, because I'm now in the hands of good people who are going to help me to be able to get these many courses going. If you want me to answer a question in a subsequent Q&A session, email me at fspina106@gmail.com. I want to thank you so very much for listening to The Bible You Thought You Knew. I have a question for you. Do you have a question or topic that you'd like me to cover on the podcast? If so, all you need to do is head over to Apple Podcasts and do 2 simple things. 1, leave a rating and review telling me what you think of the podcast. 2, in that review, ask anything you want related to the Bible. That's all you have to do. Then, listen in to hear your question answered on a future episode. Join us next time on The Bible You Thought You Knew when we discuss Jesus' personal Bible. God bless.